look at how we can transform data during the copy command. So during loading data, this can be sometimes very useful so that we can just directly get the data transformed and ready to be used in our database. So this can be part of our ETL strategy. And to do this, I will just again go ahead and copy the commands that we are going to use. Again, you'll find them in the resources of this lecture. So how does this work? The thing about this is that we can use a select in the copy command. So instead of just referring to the entire file, we can say from, we open the parentheses, and then basically we have a select statement. So this can be now using only a subset of columns. So for example, we can say I want to have the first column, and we refer to the columns by using the column number, so the column index. So $1 means the first column, so this would be the order ID, and then $2 means the second column. In this case, it would be amount. So in this case, if we would have only the order ID and the amount, so let's create this table as our orders example table, we would be able to load only this subset. So using the select command, one option would be to use only a subset of our columns, and everything else is the same. And note that also here in this select statement, we are using from, and here as a best practice, we use this as the not capitalized letters just for readability. So this is something that just shows us that this is just part of the select instead of part of our copy command. So in this case, we now want to execute this. But first of all, we want to set up this table, of course, and then we can use the copy command to load the data into our table. Let's have a look at the result. So if we now query from this table, we see everything has worked fine. So we want to see what's now in this table. And of course, indeed, we see now there are just those two columns. So it seems like it has worked well. So this was a good example. We have selected a subset and copied only the subset in our data. Maybe sometimes we have a file that contains hundreds of columns, but we only want to have the first two columns. Then we don't need to waste so many resources. So we can just focus on those two columns. So this can be very useful. Another example is we can use a SQL function. For example, we want to use, in our case, a case function. In this case, if we have a look at our original file, we can see that the amount, or to be more precise, also actually the profit, so our third column, sometimes contains negative values. And now we just want to get a flag, basically, so a label that tells us, is it profitable or is it not profitable? And we want to just categorize everything that is negative as not profitable. So for this, we just use a simple case. And note that while we can use SQL functions in the copy command, we cannot use all of them. So there's just a subset of the SQL functions that work as copy transformations. So if you want to have this full list, you can also refer to this documentation in Snowflake where they show the subset of those functions. So you can see there are quite a lot of functions, but it is just a subset and we cannot use all of them. This is just something that is worth noting. And now let's have a look at how we would do this. So again, we just structure it a bit nicer here. We use the not capitalized select here. And then afterwards, we use the first three columns. So this is why we have them here just like we had them before. Let's actually go ahead and replace our existing table so that we can have the table refreshed with our new structure. And then as the third column, we use this case when function. And in here, in this case when function, we are also using the cast function. The cast function is just casting the value, meaning it is changing the data type of the column. So this is done because we want to compare it against a numerical value. So therefore, we have to cast, so we have to change the data type of this column. So column number 3 is the profit to integer. And implicitly, when we load the data, this was already done in the copy command because this was the data type here. But since we want to use it in the case function, it is just using per default in CSV files always the string value. So it's always interpreted as string unless it would implicitly already cast it, because this is what the data type of the column expects. So then we would not have to explicitly do that. But if we would want to use it in a case or another function, we would have to cast it to an integer first in this CSV file. So in this case, if it's less than 0, it will just be not profitable, and in all other cases, it will be profitable. And don't forget the end of the case, so that this ends as the column, and then afterwards we just have again the from and everything that we have also used previously. So let's now go ahead and execute this to have a look again at the result. We see this has worked, very nice, and we can now also have a look at the table, and indeed we see those negative values have the label not profitable, and the positive ones have the label profitable. So this has worked well, which is very nice. And now one last example. We want to see how we can also use the substring function. So this is a function where we can just extract a substring of a text. So in our case, if we have a look at the column number 5, this is the category. And in here, we might want to, because maybe our report expects just the first 5 digits. So we want to just extract here the first 5 characters, and therefore we use the substring function. This means we apply it on the function. This is the first argument. So here column number 5, and then the starting point and the end point. So we start from the first character and we stop at the 5th character. So we extract the first 5 characters. And then everything again is the same. By the way, this is something that I also want to mention. Here we are just using an alias. So this makes it just a little bit easier when we work here. And this is again a best practice, even though it is not necessary, but it is good to use those aliases as a best practice. All right, so now let's again recreate our table for our last example, and now also copy this using the substring, and then again, of course, have a look at the result, what we have loaded, so that we have seen we have done this successfully, and we have now applied a few transformations on the fly during the load, which can be very useful sometimes in some cases. And now that we have seen how this works, we want to have a look at a few other options during the load, which is what we want to do in the next lecture. Let's now have a look at more transformations and options that we have available. So what are some more important techniques in the copy command? So this is something that we also should be aware of. First of all, we want to reset our table. So I created from scratch. And what we now want to have a look at is using only a subset of columns, which we actually have seen already before, but we have also seen that always the number of columns of the data source must match the number of columns in our table that we load into. So this is usually always the case. So here, if we have 4 columns in our table, we also need to load 4 columns. But what if we do not want to do this? Then in this case, it is also actually possible, but then we have to specify in which columns this should go to. So if we load only 2 columns, we need to specify those 2 columns if there are more numbers of columns. So if the number of columns doesn't match, we then need to just specify which columns we want to use. And in here also the order of them is important. So order ID is the first one. This is why this first column will go into the order ID. So like this, we can also control it. All right. So let's quickly demonstrate how this would work. So here we have done this just after the parentheses and then before the from. So just right after the table name, basically, we insert the columns, in our case, those 2. So let's load it. We see it has actually worked well. And now if we have a look at it, we can see that this has worked as expected. So we can see in this column, we have the data in those 2, and the other ones, they just remain empty. So this is something that can be also sometimes necessary. An additional technique, and this is somewhat similar, is to use default values in a given column in a table and then just also skip them during the load. So in our example, we would want to add a auto increment ourselves, because maybe this one is not really useful for us. We just want to have default values. So just 1, 2, 3, like a normal ID column. And we can do this by using auto increment. So this is basically assigning a default to this table. It starts with the value 1 and it automatically increments by 1 value with every new row that is inserted. So this is a standard behavior of our ID column. So like this, we can set up a table with an ID column. And then during the load, we can just skip this column and then just use this default value. So like this, we can say just use column 2 and 3 and just use profit and amount. So just amount and profit. This one we just leave empty, and order ID we do not even fill. So we don't mention it, we don't load it, but just use our own auto increment value. So let's see how this works, or if this works as we expected. So we create the table and now we copy just those 2 columns, profit and amount, and we use the default value of the order ID. And if we can also remove this where clause, which is something, of course, this is useful, we can now do, hopefully. But let's first have a look at the entire table, and we can see indeed now there is this order ID. And now actually, yeah, something that we can do is we can filter it using a where clause. So this makes it now much more easy to work with. So now I can say where order ID, yeah, let's say greater than 15, for example. I can execute it, and like this I can see that now we see, yeah, this one was less than 15. We can also say greater than 15, and then we can see that now we see only those greater than 15. And like this, we can more easily work with this data. All right. So these were additional things and techniques that we can apply during our copy command to transform the data. But as of now, we have seen that everything has worked well. But what happens if we have some errors in the data? So this is something, of course, we also want to address, and therefore this is something we want to talk about in the next lecture. In this lecture, we want to have a look at how we can deal with errors. And we do this by specifying the so-called on-error option. So this on-error option is a copy option that we can just specify in our copy command to specify how we should deal with errors that occur in our copy command. So that's what we want to have a look at in this lecture. And first of all, we want to create a stage object that has some stage where we have some data. And this is a file. We can have a look at this in here. So we have actually 2 files in this stage. And both of these CSV files, I have already described it in the name, they contain some errors. Note that we have this column profit, which we will also create in our table, and it is supposed to be, that's how we define it, an integer data type. So we cannot accept any text values. But actually this column in this file that we want to load, so we see there are actually text values. So obviously this will create some errors, and we want to have a look now at how Snowflake is dealing with this and how we can deal with this kind of errors by using the on-error copy option. First of all, let's load the data and see what the result will look like. We try to load it, and then we see, of course, we get this error message. Numeric value 1000 is not recognized, it doesn't work. And also we get a suggestion of what we can do to deal with this error. So it says, if you would like to continue loading when an error is encountered, use other values such as skip file or continue for the on-error option. And that's what we want to have a look at now. First of all, let's also quickly be sure to verify that there actually has no data been loaded. So we see the table is indeed completely empty. But now if we add this on-error copy option just as a copy option after our copy command, we will tell basically the copy command that load the data that comes after the errors or that are not errors anyways. So just continue with loading with the next data row and then just ignore the previous errors. So let's also execute this. And then we will see that the status now is partially loaded. So 1,500 rows have been passed, but only 1,498 have been loaded because there have been 2 errors. And we can also see the error message. Of course, numeric value is not recognized. And then also in here where the error has occurred. So first error line. And of course, in our case, this was line 2. So we can see this is where the error has occurred in the file. And now that we know this is working, let's also quickly verify that indeed the data is now available in the table. We can just query from the table to see indeed all of the data is visible. Now let's also just truncate the table so we can start again fresh. And then we want to have a look at the default behavior. So if we don't specify anything, the default will be for this on error just abort statement. So if we wouldn't mention that at all, it would be exactly with the on error set to abort statement. And this means that whenever an error is occurred, just the loading will not happen at all. So no data row will be copied. Let's quickly demonstrate this by running this command. There we should now see that everything has been skipped. So actually we see it is not working because the first file that contains error has been skipped, but only because the file was loaded before. So let's make sure we really truncate the table and we get the message statement executed successfully. Now it should give us our expected behavior. So if we now try to copy it again, we see the error message is appearing. And also note that even if we specify 2 files, so the error occurs only in the first file, the second file will also not be loaded at all. So 1 error is occurred in the entire copy statement and nothing will be copied at all. This is the default behavior. If we now also run a select on the table, we should also see the table is indeed completely empty. And if we now again truncate our table and let's make sure we get the right value of statement executed successfully, we can have a look now at the next and last option, which is skip file. So that's another behavior that is different from abort statement and also continue statement. So it is in between, because this means now that whenever an error occurs, this exact file where the error has occurred will be skipped, but the other files can still be loaded. So for example, in here, if we have an error in the first file, then this file will be skipped, but we will still load the data from the next file. Let's demonstrate this by running the second copy command as well. We will see that the data in the first file has not been loaded because load has been failed, but indeed we have the second file that has completely been loaded. We can again verify this by having a look at the rows. So let's execute this query where we just have a look at the data. We see the data files are included. But now if let's again truncate our table, we want to see an alternative to skip file. So this is just some additional value that we can add in the skip file option. And this is to specify underscore and then an absolute number. So in here we see we can add a number and this will now be the error limit. And if we are below this error limit, the file will completely be loaded. Of course, the errors will be ignored, but it will basically behave as the same as continue. And if we reach this error of, in this case, 2 or 3 or whatever number we specify, if this is reached, the file will be skipped. So we know we have 2 errors in this file, and if we try to copy that now, we should now see that this has completely been loaded because the error limit of 3 that we have specified in here has not been reached. So we see 2 errors, has not reached the error limit, and therefore everything will be just normally loaded. Let's again truncate the table, and then we want to try again with a value of, for example, 2. So if we specify 2, we know that the error limit will be reached because we indeed have 2 errors. Same would be, of course, if we use the value 1. Then this file will be skipped. So the error limit in file 1 has been reached. Therefore, this file will be skipped, but we will still load the data from the second file. We can see for the first file, load has failed, error limit has been reached, but still we load the data from the second file. So this is the option with the skip file. And actually also, we don't necessarily need to specify an absolute number, but we can also, let's again truncate our table, of course, first. Then we can also specify a percentage. So if we specify this percentage, for example, let's say 3%, this will be the error limit as a dynamic value. So this is a percentage of the total amount of rows. So if we have in our case 1500 rows, we specify 3% as error limit, it will be 45 rows because 3% of 1500 is 45. And of course, since the error limit has not been reached with our 2 errors, this will be loaded just normally. And then we can just continue, of course, also with the other files. So in this lecture, we have seen the first copy option, which is the on-error option. We've seen the default value is just a board statement, so nothing will be loaded at all, but we also can just completely ignore all of the errors. We can also say, just go to the next file, don't load from this file, or we can even specify an error limit in the skip file value. So up until now, we have always specified the file format in our copy command. That means for every copy command, we have specifically defined the file format. That means the type, in this case it is a CSV, the field delimiter, which is a comma in this case, and also in this case, whether we want to skip the header or not. So this is something we can do. This is totally fine, but there is another way of doing that. And this is even a little bit better because it is more of a best practice. Because this file format can be actually also defined as an object. Same as a stage, we have defined this stage as an object, and we can do the same thing for creating a file format object. And then we can always reuse this file format object in our copy commands. So let's see how we can do this. First, we want to create a table so that we can work with the examples here. So we've created this table, and now again, so that we keep things organized, we will create a schema in our manage database. And the schema is called file formats. So this is where we will put all of our file formats in. And again, this is not mandatory. This is just a best practice to keep things organized. Now let's create our file format object. It is pretty simple. So as we know, we can just use the create or replace command. Then we mention the keyword file format. And after that, we mention the fully qualified name. In our case, it is managedb.fileformats. This is the schema we've just created, and here we can specify the file format name as my file format. Let's go ahead and run this command, and we see this file format with the name my file format has been successfully created. And you also see that here everything is in all caps. This is because this is the standard here in Snowflake, and therefore it doesn't matter whether we write things in all caps or if we don't write them in all caps. So now that we've created this file format, let's have a look at this object. We can see the properties of this file format object using the describe statement. So here we have run this statement using again the keyword and the name of this file format, and here we see all of the properties. So in here we see that we have a lot of properties. For example, we have the property type, which is as a default set to CSV. So since we have not altered or changed anything for this value in here, this is also the value that we have here for our file format object. And the same thing we also have for field delimiter, which is set to a comma. And these are the properties that we have available in here. So as we see in here, there are a lot more properties than just the type, the field delimiter, and whether we want to skip the header or not. So now that we have created this object, we can also use it here in our copy command. Let's have a look at how we can do this. So if we want to use this format object in our copy command, we can just do this here by specifying the file format name. So we say just format name, and then we just use the fully qualified name of this file format in here. And the rest of the things we can just keep as they are. And therefore, let's have a look and run this command to see what we get. So we see here there has been some errors, and this is because we of course also have to select a warehouse, and currently there is no warehouse selected. So let's select a warehouse. We have here, if we have a look at this file format again, because here we have 5 errors. And let's have a look at this object to see if we can find out why this has happened. So here we have the type, we have the skip header, which is set to false. So it is set to 0. But luckily, we have a couple of options. So for example, we could alter the file format. So for example, we could alter here, we could use this alter statement and here alter the object type file format, and here is our file format name. So for example, we could set the field delimiter to a different value, or we could also use the skip header and change this property to 1. So if we are doing this, let's run this statement again and have a look again here at the result. So now we have here within this file format the skip header set to true. And now we should have less errors. Let's have a look at this in here. So now everything has worked. Of course, we have again these 2 errors, but those are the errors that we expect, that here this 1000 is not a numerical value. So this is how we can change or alter the properties in a given file format object. But we have another option. Because maybe if we are creating a file format object, we don't want to use all of the default properties. Of course, this is usually the case that we want to change some types or some properties in here. And if we do this, if we define this object, then we can set all of the properties as we would like to have them. For example, we can set the type here in this object to JSON and the time format to auto. So let's go ahead and run this statement here as well. We have successfully created this file format object. And now let's have a look at the properties of this object. So now in here we see that the properties are now set to JSON for the type, and the default of course is CSV, but in this object the property value is JSON. And if we are looking at the result again, we will see that it will not work because the file format is JSON and we are working with a CSV file in here. So therefore we first need to change the type of this file format object. So we want to change this to the type from JSON to CSV. But we will see that this will not work in Snowflake because depending on the type, if we have CSV or JSON, there are different file format options attached to this file format object. So for CSV type, we have different file format options than we have in the JSON file format object. And therefore it is not possible to alter or change this type to another type. So therefore we get here this message, file format type cannot be changed. In this case, we really need to recreate this file format object. We will do this using the create or replace, and as the default is CSV, if we don't give any information here on the type, it will be automatically a CSV type. Let's have a look at the properties, and there we will see that in this case, this is of the type CSV. But we can also just override certain properties of an existing file format object just for one single copy command. Like this, we won't use the file format option from this file format object, but we will just use what we have specified in the copy command. For example, our file format object is of the type CSV and it has at the skip header option the value 0. So if we have a look in here, we see skip header property is at 0 because this is the default value. But if we in the copy command, if we have here file format, and then we use this file format, and then we can just add here the additional file format options that we want to use in this single copy command in here. So if we set this to 1, then for this copy command, the skip header is set to true, and therefore for this copy command, the header will be skipped. So this is an option that we can use if we want to use a certain file format object with just an altered file format option. Now here is something a little bit surprising, because we can also, if we have a look at the stage object, define these properties in the stage object instead of the file format object. So here we see that if we describe here the properties of this stage object, such as type and field delimiter, skip header and so on, are also defined in our stage object. In fact, if we have a look at the properties available in the stage object and compare it with the file format object, we see that almost all of the properties are the same, and all of the file format properties are also available in the stage object. So we could just easily define all of the properties also in the stage object. But it's just a best practice to use a separate file format, to keep things a little bit separate and independent, and therefore we can use here this file format object to override the properties here of this stage object. So if we specify here in our case the file format in here, then all of the file format properties will be overwritten. And then also in here we have on top of that here also the stage copy options. So these are also available here in our stage object. So this is what we should know about the file format object and using that within our copy command. So now that we've learned so much about the copy command, stage objects, transforming the data, and the file format, I think it's time to summarize what we've learned and then again, of course, also practice what we've learned. So in this section we've learned about one of the most important things in Snowflake, and that is how we can load our data from a stage into our databases and into our tables. So to do this, we've learned about the two different loading methods and then also what a stage is and how we can create such a stage. So this is what we need to do in order to be able to copy data from this external stage into our tables. After we have created this stage, we've learned about the important copy command. And in this copy command, we can use this stage that we've created and load our data into our tables. And also for this copy command, we have some transformation options available. And we can do these transformations using the select statement, where we can use some SQL functions and transform our data if we want to do this. After we've learned about these transformation options, we have learned about the copy option on error, which helps us to handle errors. So if we are using this on error option, we have some possibilities how errors that occur are handled. So the first option is that we can just set this on error option to continue. And then the errors will just be ignored and everything except the errors will be loaded within this copy command. The standard in this copy option on error is abort statement. That means that nothing will be copied and the copying will be just stopped. And then also we've learned about the skip file option. So these are the options we can take if we are handling errors. So this is a very important option if we want to know how we can handle errors. After that, we've also learned about the file format object, which is a database object, same as the stage object. And within this file format object, we can store information about the files or how the files should be interpreted if we load them from an external stage. So this is what we have learned in this lecture, and since I think it's the best to learn practice-oriented and hands-on, let's go ahead and practice what we've learned in this section.